The moment a person says no to unlimited power, you discover who they really are. No one in the ballroom expected the richest man on earth to hear that word. And no one expected it to come from a waitress. The grand ballroom of the Sterling Foundation shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers worth more than most American homes. Gold light reflected across polished marble floors. A string quartet played softly near the stage while politicians, celebrities, CEOs, and investors moved through the room, carrying glasses of sparkling water and expensive wine. Every conversation seemed to orbit around one man. Ethan Sterling, founder, visionary, billionaire, the man whose companies shaped everything from artificial intelligence to clean energy. The man whose net worth had surpassed every living billionaire on the planet. Wherever Ethan walked, attention followed. Wherever he spoke, people listened. Wherever he looked, doors opened. For nearly 20 years, that had been the rhythm of his life. Tonight was no different. Cameras flashed. Executives smiled too quickly. Investors laughed a little too loudly. Everyone wanted something from Ethan Sterling. Everyone except one person. Claire Bennett moved quietly between tables, carrying a silver tray balanced effortlessly in one hand. Her black uniform was simple. Her hair was tied neatly behind her head. Most guests never looked directly at her. To them, she was part of the background. Another server. Another invisible face helping the evening run smoothly. Claire preferred it that way. She smiled when necessary, spoke politely when spoken to, then returned to her work. While billion-dollar conversations filled the room, she focused on empty glasses and folded napkins. Yet throughout the evening, Ethan found his attention drifting toward her. At first, he couldn't explain why. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to get noticed. In a room filled with people competing for attention, she seemed completely indifferent to it. And somehow, that made her impossible to ignore. The first time their eyes met, she simply nodded and continued walking. No excitement, no nervousness, no recognition, just calm. Professionalism. Ethan wasn't used to that. Most people reacted when they realized who he was. Claire didn't. An hour later, after a successful charity presentation that raised hundreds of millions of dollars, guests gathered near the stage for photographs and interviews. Ethan stood surrounded by reporters when he noticed Claire helping an elderly guest adjust her chair. The woman thanked her. Claire smiled warmly and returned to work. No cameras, no audience, no applause, just kindness. Something about that stayed with him. Later, as the evening began winding down, Ethan made a decision. The kind of decision that usually worked out exactly as he expected. He crossed the ballroom. Conversations quieted as people noticed him moving with purpose. Some assumed he was heading toward an investor. Others thought it was a senator waiting nearby. Instead, Ethan stopped directly in front of Claire. The room seemed to pause. Claire looked up from the tray she was carrying. Ethan offered a polite smile. "Claire, right?" She nodded. "Yes, sir. I've been hoping to speak with you." Nearby guests exchanged curious glances. Claire remained calm. Ethan continued. "After your shift, I'd like to invite you to dinner." Silence spread outward like a ripple through water. A billionaire asking a waitress to dinner was already surprising. What happened next stunned everyone. Claire smiled kindly. Not nervously. Not awkwardly. Kindly. Then she said 4 simple words. "No. Thank you, Mr. Sterling." The room froze. Ethan blinked. For a brief moment. Even he seemed unsure whether he had heard correctly. Claire's expression never changed. She wasn't angry. She wasn't impressed. She wasn't playing a game. She simply adjusted the tray in her hands, nodded once, then walked away, leaving the richest man alive standing alone beneath the crystal lights while hundreds of people watched in complete silence. For the next several seconds, nobody moved. The music continued. Glasses clinked somewhere near the back of the ballroom. Yet the moment lingered in the air like a question nobody could answer. Ethan Sterling stood perfectly still, watching the woman disappear into the crowd of guests. Hey, refusal was not supposed to feel unusual. People declined invitations every day. Business proposals failed. Deals collapsed. Opportunities came and went. But this felt different. Not because she had said no, because she had meant it. There had been no hesitation in Claire Bennett's voice. No nervous laughter. No attempt to soften the answer. She had not looked intimidated. She had not looked impressed. She had simply answered honestly and returned to work. Around the room, whispers quietly began to spread. Several guests exchanged confused looks. A famous actor near the stage raised an eyebrow. Two executives standing by the auction display suddenly seemed far more interested in the waitress than the charity event. Ethan noticed none of them. His attention remained fixed on the doorway Claire had just disappeared through. For the first time in years, something had happened that he could not immediately explain. Across the ballroom, Claire carried a tray of empty glasses toward the service corridor. Her pace never changed. Her breathing remained steady. If anyone had expected her hands to shake after turning down the most powerful man in the room, they would have been disappointed. She pushed through the swinging kitchen doors and entered the quiet service area behind the ballroom. Stainless steel counters reflected the bright overhead lights. The distant sound of the orchestra faded into a soft murmur. One of the other servers immediately hurried toward her. "Claire, do you realize who that was?" the young woman whispered. Claire placed several glasses into a rack. "Of course. Then why did you say no?" Claire smiled slightly. "Because it was the honest answer." The server stared at her as if she had just spoken another language. Claire did not elaborate. She never felt the need to explain herself. For most of her life, people assumed every decision revolved around money, status, or opportunity. Claire had learned long ago that the most important choices rarely involved any of those things. 20 minutes later, the gala finally began winding down. Guests collected coats and exchanged final conversations. Luxury cars lined the street outside beneath the glow of Manhattan lights. Ethan completed 3 interviews, greeted dozens of donors, and signed several agreements worth millions of dollars. Through it all, his thoughts kept returning to the same question. Why? Not why she rejected him personally. Why she seemed completely untouched by everything surrounding him. The wealth, the influence, the attention. Most people reacted before he even spoke. Claire had looked directly at him and seen nothing extraordinary. That realization unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Near midnight, Ethan stepped outside into the cool autumn air. A black sedan waited at the curb. His chief assistant opened the rear door. "Successful evening?" she asked. Ethan glanced back toward the grand entrance where employees were leaving through a side exit. Among them, he spotted Claire walking alone toward a subway station 2 blocks away. No limousine, no private driver, no cameras following her. Just a woman carrying a worn canvas bag beneath the city lights. Ethan watched until she disappeared into the crowd. Then he quietly said something that surprised even himself. "Find out who Claire Bennett really is." By 7 o'clock the next morning, Ethan Sterling was already in his office overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Sunlight spilled across floor-to-ceiling windows while screens displayed market reports from around the world. Normally, this was his favorite hour of the day. Quiet, predictable, efficient. Today felt different. A thin file rested on the corner of his desk. Claire Bennett. The report had arrived before sunrise. Ethan opened it expecting answers. Instead, he found more questions. 28 years old. Born in Vermont. No criminal record. No social media presence worth mentioning. No expensive purchases. No unusual connections. Her financial history was remarkably ordinary. A modest apartment in Brooklyn. Consistent employment. Small savings account. No signs that she was secretly wealthy. No evidence that she came from privilege. Nothing explained the calm confidence he had seen the previous night. Ethan flipped through the pages again. Most people left footprints everywhere. Claire seemed to move through life without leaving any. His assistant entered carrying coffee. "Anything interesting?" she asked. Ethan closed the file. "Not yet." Across the city, Claire's morning looked very different. Her apartment measured less than 700 square feet. The kitchen was small. The furniture was worn but clean. Sunlight filtered through old curtains as she prepared breakfast while listening to a local radio station. The apartment felt quiet, comfortable, real. There were no marble floors, no private staff, no luxury views. Yet Claire moved through her morning with the same calm presence she had carried through the ballroom. She watered a small collection of plants near the window, checked her schedule, answered a text message, then headed for work. The subway ride took nearly 40 minutes. Around her, commuters scrolled through phones, drank coffee, and hurried toward another day. Nobody recognized her. Nobody pointed. Nobody knew that dozens of influential people had spent the previous night discussing her decision. Back in Manhattan, Ethan found himself distracted throughout the day. During meetings, he caught himself wondering what Claire had been thinking when she declined his invitation. During conference calls, he replayed the conversation in his head. For simple words. No. Thank you, Mr. Sterling. The memory should have faded by now. Instead, it seemed to grow stronger. By late afternoon, curiosity had become something else. Determination. Ethan was not accustomed to unfinished puzzles. That evening, another report arrived. This one contained information that finally caught his attention. A manager from the charity gala had included employee evaluations. Claire's name appeared repeatedly. Reliable, professional, respected by coworkers. Volunteers requested her specifically. Guests often wrote positive comments about her service. One handwritten note stood out. She treats every person exactly the same, whether they arrive in a limousine or on foot. Ethan read that sentence twice. Then a third time. Outside his office, Manhattan glowed beneath thousands of lights. Somewhere beyond those buildings, Claire was finishing another shift, living another ordinary evening, completely unaware that one of the most powerful men in the world was staring at a single sentence and feeling something unfamiliar. Respect. Not because she had rejected him, but because she seemed completely uninterested in the things everyone else chased. For the first time, Ethan began to suspect that Claire Bennett was not hiding a secret. Perhaps the truth was far simpler. Perhaps she genuinely valued something that money could not buy. And that possibility intrigued him more than any mystery ever had. 3 days passed. Then 4. Most people assumed the unusual moment at the gala had already faded into memory. They were wrong. Ethan Sterling found himself thinking about Claire Bennett more often than he cared to admit. Not because she had rejected him. Successful people faced rejection all the time. Investors said no. Governments said no. Markets said no. What unsettled him was something much simpler. He could not understand her. For years, Ethan had built his life around understanding people. He could predict competitors before they acted. He could read negotiations before they began. He could walk into a room and identify what every person wanted within minutes. Claire remained the exception. One Thursday evening, Ethan attended another charity event across town. The ballroom was elegant. The speeches were polished. The guests were influential. Yet halfway through dinner, he realized he was bored. The conversations felt familiar. The compliments sounded rehearsed. Even the laughter seemed predictable. Meanwhile, several miles away in Brooklyn, Claire sat at a small wooden table inside a community center. There were no cameras, no reporters, no wealthy donors. Around her sat 12 middle school students working through homework assignments. Claire moved quietly from desk to desk, helping where she could. One student struggled with algebra. Another needed help preparing a presentation. A third simply wanted someone to listen. Claire gave each of them the same patience she brought to everything else. She never mentioned the gala. Never mentioned Ethan Sterling. In fact, she rarely talked about herself at all. The students knew her simply as Miss Claire. Someone who showed up every Thursday evening without fail. Someone who remembered birthdays. Someone who stayed late when a student needed extra help. Later that night, after the tutoring session ended, Claire stacked books and turned off lights. She never noticed the silver sedan parked across the street. Inside sat one of Ethan's security consultants. The assignment had been simple. Observe. Report. Nothing more. The following morning, a new file appeared on Ethan's desk. This report was different from the others. It contained no scandals, no hidden fortunes, no dramatic secrets. Instead, it listed ordinary acts repeated over and over again. Volunteer tutoring, food drives, weekend reading programs, anonymous donations to local school projects. Ethan read every page in silence. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and stared through the glass walls of his office. "That is it?" he asked. His assistant looked confused. "What do you mean?" Ethan tapped the report. "There has to be more. That is everything we found." The room grew quiet. Ethan glanced down once more. Most public figures carefully documented every charitable act. They posted photographs, issued press releases, built entire brands around generosity. Claire had done the opposite. Many of the organizations she helped had no idea she was involved beyond showing up every week. There was no audience, no reward, no recognition, just consistent kindness. Ethan closed the file slowly. For the first time, he began questioning something far larger than Claire herself. He began questioning the people around him, the executives who praised him, the advisors who agreed with him, the social circles that revolved around influence and status. Claire seemed to belong to a completely different world. A world where value was measured by actions instead of attention. And for reasons he could not fully explain, that world was becoming harder and harder to ignore. 2 weeks later, Ethan Sterling made a decision that surprised even his closest advisors. He was going to stop studying reports and start finding answers himself. Not through investigators, not through assistants, through observation. On a rainy Tuesday evening, he walked into a small neighborhood cafe 3 blocks from the community center where Claire volunteered. The place was modest. Exposed brick walls, wooden tables, soft jazz playing through old speakers. Nobody looked twice at him. It was one of the few places in New York where his presence did not immediately become an event. Ethan ordered coffee and chose a table near the window. 20 minutes later, Claire entered carrying a canvas tote bag filled with books. She looked exactly as she always did. Calm, focused, unhurried. She greeted the cashier by name, asked about his daughter, then ordered the least expensive item on the menu and sat alone near the back. Ethan watched quietly. There was no performance, no carefully crafted image. She behaved exactly the same way she had in every report he had read. An hour passed. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly man entered the cafe. His clothes were clean but worn. He searched his pockets and approached the counter with visible embarrassment. After a brief conversation, he began turning toward the door. Claire stood before he reached it. She spoke softly. The man hesitated, then smiled. Minutes later, he sat across from her sharing a meal she had purchased without making a scene. Ethan noticed something important. She did not look around to see who was watching. She never expected recognition. She simply helped because someone needed help. The next morning, Ethan initiated what he privately called a test. Through a foundation program, an anonymous scholarship opportunity was delivered to Claire. It included generous funding and connections to prestigious institutions. Most applicants would have accepted immediately. Claire declined within 48 hours. The reason was simple. She believed another candidate needed it more. Ethan read the response twice, then 3 times. A week later, a second opportunity appeared. A leadership position at a nonprofit organization with a 6-figure salary. Flexible hours. Excellent benefits. The kind of offer many people spent years pursuing. Claire thanked the recruiter and declined. Again, Ethan frowned as he stared at the email. Nobody turned down opportunities like these. Not repeatedly. Not without hesitation. Yet Claire seemed completely comfortable walking away. Curious became fascinated. Fascinated became determined. Finally, Ethan instructed one of his companies to make a substantial donation to the community center where Claire volunteered. The center director was overjoyed. New computers arrived. Educational materials were purchased. Several programs expanded overnight. Ethan waited for Claire's reaction. Surely this time she would ask questions. Surely she would connect the dots. Instead, Claire simply celebrated with the students. She spent the evening helping unpack boxes and organize classrooms. She never asked who deserved credit. She only cared that the children would benefit. Sitting alone in his office later that night, Ethan looked out over the city lights and slowly realized something remarkable. Every test had failed, not because Claire was hiding something, because she genuinely measured success differently than everyone he knew. For the first time in his life, Ethan Sterling encountered a person who could not be influenced by status, impressed by wealth, or distracted by opportunity. And instead of losing interest, he found himself wanting to understand her more than ever. 1 month later, Ethan Sterling stopped pretending his interest was purely intellectual. The reports had ended. The observations had ended. Yet Claire Bennett remained in his thoughts with a persistence that made no sense. One Friday evening, after finishing a board meeting that involved billions of dollars and executives from 3 continents, Ethan found himself standing outside the same community center Claire visited every week. Rain drifted softly across the sidewalk. Yellow light glowed through the windows. Children's laughter echoed from inside. Through the glass, he saw Claire sitting beside a young girl helping her practice reading. There was nothing dramatic about the scene. No audience. No cameras. No recognition. Just patience. The kind that could not be manufactured. Ethan remained outside longer than he intended. For years, success had trained him to look for outcomes. Results. Returns. Yet watching Claire, he realized she rarely focused on outcomes at all. She focused on people. The distinction seemed small. It was not. A few days later, Ethan finally decided to speak with her again. Not as the richest man in the world. Not as a celebrity. Just as himself. He arrived at the small cafe where she often stopped after tutoring sessions. Claire looked mildly surprised when he approached her table. Not shocked. Not impressed. Simply surprised. "Mr. Sterling," she said politely. Ethan smiled. "Ethan is fine." Claire closed the book she had been reading. "What brings you here?" Ethan laughed softly. "That is probably the first honest question anyone has asked me this week." Something about the answer made Claire smile. The conversation that followed was unlike any Ethan had experienced in years. Claire did not ask about his companies. She did not ask about private jets, investments, or famous acquaintances. Instead, she asked whether he enjoyed his work, whether he slept enough, whether success had made him happier than he expected. The questions caught him off guard. Most people wanted access to his resources. Claire seemed interested only in the human being sitting across from her. For nearly an hour they talked. Books, childhood memories, teachers who changed their lives, mistakes they regretted, small victories nobody else noticed. For the first time in years, Ethan spoke without calculating how his words would be received. When the conversation ended, Claire gathered her things and stood. "Thank you for the coffee," she said. "Thank you for the conversation," Ethan replied. Claire hesitated. Then she said something he would remember for a long time. "You know, Ethan, people spend so much time talking about your success that I think they forget to ask whether you are doing okay." The words landed quietly, yet they struck deeper than any compliment ever had. Claire walked away moments later, disappearing into the evening crowd. Ethan remained seated by the window long after she left. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Around him, strangers continued ordinary conversations. For the first time in a very long time, Ethan felt something unfamiliar. Not admiration, not ambition, not competition, gratitude. Because somewhere along the way, a waitress who wanted nothing from him had become the first person to truly see him. Autumn slowly gave way to winter. The city streets glittered beneath holiday lights. Store windows filled with decorations. Crowds moved through Manhattan carrying gifts and warm drinks while cold winds swept between the buildings. Life continued as usual for most people. Yet something had changed for Ethan Sterling. For the first time in decades, his calendar no longer felt like the center of his world. He still attended meetings, still signed contracts, still managed companies worth billions. But somewhere between conference calls and boardrooms, he had begun making time for things that once seemed unimportant. Community events, school programs, conversations without agendas. Claire never asked him to do any of it. That was precisely why he did. Then one snowy evening, everything shifted. Ethan arrived at the community center carrying several boxes of books that had been requested for the reading program. The building looked unusually quiet. Most classrooms were empty. The cheerful energy he normally felt there seemed absent. As he walked down the hallway, he noticed a light glowing beneath a partially open office door. Inside sat Claire, alone. At first, he almost did not recognize her. She was staring at paperwork spread across a desk. Her shoulders seemed heavier somehow. Tired. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. Ethan hesitated before knocking softly. Claire looked up and quickly attempted a smile. It was not her usual smile. "You are still here," Ethan said gently. "So are you," Claire replied. He stepped inside and set the boxes down. For a moment neither spoke. Then Ethan noticed a photograph lying beside the paperwork. Several children from the tutoring program stood together, smiling for the camera. One face had been circled in blue ink. A young boy named Marcus. Ethan remembered him. Bright. Curious. Always asking questions. "Is everything okay?" he asked quietly. Claire looked down at the photograph. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then her composure finally cracked. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just enough for the truth to emerge. "Marcus and his mother are moving away," she said. "His family lost their apartment." Ethan remained silent. Claire continued. "He told me today that he might have to leave school for a while." She laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. He was worried about missing math class. Her eyes glistened as she looked at the photograph again. Ethan felt his chest tighten. This was not about money. It was not about inconvenience. Claire was hurting because someone else was hurting. "You care about them very much," he said. Claire nodded. "They deserve better than the choices life keeps giving them." For the first time since meeting her, Ethan saw tears quietly escape down her cheeks. She wiped them away almost immediately. Not out of embarrassment, Out of habit, the room grew still. Snow drifted outside the window. Cars passed beneath streetlights. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed through the city. Ethan realized something profound in that moment. Claire's strength had never come from being unaffected by hardship. It came from caring despite it. Most people protected themselves by becoming indifferent. Claire remained open, compassionate, vulnerable, and somehow stronger because of it. As she sat there worrying about a child who was not even her own, Ethan understood why no amount of money had ever impressed her. Her heart was already invested in something far more valuable. The following week, Ethan could not stop thinking about that evening in the office. Not because Claire had shown emotion. Everyone did. It was because of what it cost it. She had not been worried about herself. She had been worried about someone else. That realization stayed with him long after the snow had melted from the sidewalks. A few days later, Ethan invited Claire to lunch. Not at a luxury restaurant. Not at a private club. Just a quiet diner overlooking the East River. To his surprise, she accepted. They sat beside a large window while ferries crossed the gray water in the distance. For a while they talked about ordinary things. Books, winter weather, childhood memories. Then Ethan finally asked the question that had been lingering in his mind since the gala. Why did you say no? Claire looked out the window for several moments before answering. Most people assume they already know what you mean. Ethan smiled faintly. Then tell me what I meant. Claire folded her hands around a warm coffee mug. The night we met, everyone in that ballroom saw the richest man in the world. Ethan listened quietly, but I saw a man surrounded by people trying to impress him. She paused. And when you invited me to dinner, I realized something. What? Claire's voice remained gentle. I did not want to become another person reacting to your position instead of your character. The words settled between them. Ethan said nothing. Claire continued. Money is not the problem. Success is not the problem. The problem is when people stop seeing each other as human beings. Outside, a ferry horn echoed across the river. I have watched people spend their entire lives chasing titles, attention, and approval, Claire said softly. Then one day they wake up and realize they forgot who they were before everyone started applauding. Ethan stared at the table. No board member had ever spoken to him like this. No advisor. No executive. Yet somehow every word felt true. So you rejected me because I was rich? He asked. Claire shook her head immediately. No. Her answer came without hesitation. I rejected the assumption behind the invitation. Ethan looked up. Claire met his eyes calmly. I rejected the idea that status should automatically open doors that character has not earned. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Honest silence. The kind that appears when someone finally hears something they needed to hear. Ethan leaned back slowly. For years he had believed influence solved problems, opened opportunities, created connections. Yet Claire was describing a different world. One where trust came before access, where respect came before admiration, where people mattered more than power. You know what is strange? Ethan asked. Claire smiled. What? The more you explain it, the less offended I feel. Claire laughed softly. It was the first completely carefree laugh he had heard from her. Good, she said. Because it was never meant as an insult. They remained at the diner for another hour. When they finally stood to leave, Ethan felt lighter than he had in years. Not because he had changed Claire's mind, but because Claire had changed his perspective. As they stepped outside into the cold afternoon air, Ethan realized the answer he had spent months searching for was remarkably simple. Claire Bennett had never been resisting him. She had been protecting something far more important. The belief that a person's worth should never depend on how much money stands in front of them. 1 year later, the city looked the same. The towers still touched the clouds. Traffic still flowed through Manhattan. Screens still flashed stock prices across financial districts. Yet for Ethan Sterling, almost everything had changed. His companies continued to grow. His wealth continued to increase. Reporters still followed his appearances. Investors still analyzed his every decision. But the center of his life had quietly shifted. On a crisp spring morning, Ethan stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony of a new educational center in Brooklyn. Children laughed nearby as families filled the courtyard. Teachers greeted students. Volunteers carried boxes of books through wide glass doors. The building was beautiful, but that was not what made Ethan smile. What mattered was why it existed. A year earlier, he would have measured success by valuation reports and quarterly earnings. Now he found himself measuring it differently. How many students would study there? How many families would benefit? How many futures might change because someone believed in them? Across the courtyard, Claire Bennett helped arrange chairs for the ceremony. As always, she avoided attention whenever possible. Several reporters attempted to interview her. She politely redirected them toward the teachers and volunteers who had worked alongside her. Ethan watched from a distance and laughed softly. Some things never changed. When the ceremony ended, the crowd gradually dispersed. Children explored classrooms. Parents toured the building. Reporters packed away cameras. Eventually, Ethan and Claire found themselves standing alone beneath a row of newly planted trees. For a moment, neither spoke. The afternoon sunlight filtered through fresh green leaves. Somewhere nearby, a child shouted excitedly about finding his favorite book in the library. "You did not have to do all this," Claire said quietly. Ethan looked around. "A year ago, I probably would have done it for recognition." Claire smiled. "And now?" Ethan considered the question carefully. "Now I think I finally understand something." Claire waited. "Success is not what you keep," he said. "It is what remains after you give something away." Claire's smile widened. Not because the answer was perfect, because it was honest. The two stood together watching families enter the building. No photographers surrounded them. No executives interrupted them. No audience waited for a speech. Just a simple moment between two people whose lives had unexpectedly crossed paths. Ethan thought back to the night they first met beneath